welcome back to the channel. Today's video is about how to build a CRUD API in Azure Functions. Apparently there are many ways to skin a cat. This time we are going to follow the example on Azure Documentation. We are going to use an Azure SQL Database to create an item, then read an item based on the parameters we provide in the API, and in the end delete an item from the table. We will use an Upsert Azure function which performs a merge statement behind the scene, another Azure function to read the data from the database given the parameter we pass, and another Azure function to delete the records we specify. If you want an introduction to Azure Functions, please watch my other video because today we are diving into the implementation right away. Apparently the first thing we need to do is to create a function app first. Let's create a new one called func demo. That's fine. You have to select your resource group, then runtime stack. For us that would be Python version 3.10. I'm in West Europe right now. Linux and hosting options and plans consumption, serverless. Storage, if you don't select one, it's going to create a new one automatically. Enable public access. Monitoring, let's enable application insights just in case we can see the logs. Review and create, and let's create a function app. It's going to take 1 minute. It's not that horrible. In the meantime, we need to provide access to Azure SQL Server. So this function app needs to have access to Azure SQL Server in order to perform all these operations, the insertions, the deletions, the updates, etc., etc. How can we do that? There are two ways to do that. So if you go, I have already created an SQL server and I have already an SQL database. One way is to go into your SQL server, scroll down until you find Azure Active Directory. Right now, I don't have anyone as admin. There are two ways to actually provide access to your function app in Azure SQL Database. One of those is to set your function app as an admin. Now, if you search for your function app here, it's not going to appear. Why? Because we haven't enabled the managed identity of our function app. So go back to your function app you created, scroll down and find the identity blade. Click on the identity and switch to status on, click on save, and this will enable the managed identity of your function app. And now that we have the object, the principal ID, you can click that here or just type the name of the function app. That would be func or demo, and you will find it here. You click on that, you click on select, and you provide the admin role to your function app. This is not usually recommended because you want to be the admin, not managed identity of the function app. So you can set yourself as an admin, right? This is me. I click on select, click on save. You set yourself as an admin, and then what you need to do is go to your database and run this SQL statement. So we run this command, create user func app demo from external provider, and then we alter the role and we add member our function app as a member. So now our function app has access to our database. That's the second way and the preferable one. The next step is to create a function in our function app. Now, if we scroll to functions here in our function app and we click on create, we can create a function in the portal, but I think it's better if we use VS Code for development, right? It would be easier, it would be much faster to develop. But let me show you the documentation first, and here is the example of how you can create let's say you can perform an create an Upsert function in Azure Functions. You have to search for SQL output binding, right? And this is the first thing you need to do is to create apparently a table in your database, and then in your function.json you need to create a out direction item here, and you provide the name of your output binding, type SQL, command text, that would be the name of your table, and you provide, of course, the connection string setting here. So let's copy that SQL statement, go into our database, paste it here. Let's make it simpler. So just leave ID and title and just a primary key, ID as a primary key. And let's create this table. Include data type. I think I forgot that. So integer. And here we have our table. Now be careful, you need to specify a primary key because automatically Azure functions perform a merge statement based on the primary key of the table. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I switched to VS Code. Now here, what we have to do first is to install the Azure extension and sign in our Azure subscription. And you basically, if you expand the function app, you will see the function app that we just created, func app or demo, right? It doesn't have any functions because we haven't created anything. Let's create a new function now. Click on that here. And let's call it, let's browse and yeah, click on local directory, just an empty folder you have. Click on Python. Yep, Python 3.9, and we want an HTTP trigger. And let's call this Upsert, right? Let's authorization level anonymous. Now it's not recommended apparently when you are developing in production. This is just a demo, of course. It is creating our virtual environment, and yep, here it is. This is our HTTP trigger. As you can see, we have an input request, HTTP request, because we are going to build an API apparently, and this is the default example that Azure Functions provide. Now, if you see here, and if you scroll down to the requirements.txt, you will see that it has Azure Functions. Let's go back to our function, and here we have the bindings, right? By default, these are the bindings. Remember, what we want now is one more item here, and let's call it Upsert item, and then it's type SQL, right? And then we have direction, that would be out because we write in the database. Remember, the input binding pass data to our function. When we execute our function, the function runtime will get the data specified in the binding. On the other hand, output bindings are resources that we write the output of our function. And this time we are writing data in the database. So next would be command text, right? Command text would be just pointing to the database. So DBO to do, right? And the last thing, we need to provide the connection string setting. Let's call it SQL connection string. Save that. The next thing we need to do is actually go into our init.py file here and add one more parameter. That would be the Upsert item parameter. The parameter is exactly what we gave as a name here, Upsert item. Just copy that, paste it here, func.out, because it's going to our database, and func.sql row. If you have the autocomplete, yeah, it's pretty easy. You don't have to type much, right? We don't need something so Let's simplify things. We need to get from the request, we need to get the body. So let's no, let's actually say body actually request get JSON, come on. And then in order to get the data in a way to insert it into our database, we have to use the func.sql row dot from dict and provide the body here. And now what you have to do is get the upsert item from here dot set, right, and then set the row that you just created up here, and this is going to insert the data or update the record if the record already exists in the database. Let's add an except here, except value error pass, right? And if body is not empty, then return success, otherwise return failure, and save that, right? We are good to go. Now let me switch tabs and let me show you the documentation. Here is the documentation. As you can see, it's exactly the same thing. I just made it a bit simpler to do. It's getting the JSON from the request, and then it's using the map here, map and the lambda, the anonymous function, to perform the transformations. And here it sets the data if you have multiple records, right? Pretty easy, I think. But you have the code on the documentation, so you don't have to worry much about that. Now let's create another function for when we want to read from the database. If you go into the documentation, you can scroll down. Here you can also see that we can use two output, so we can write two different tables using the same request. You just one more item here that points to another table direction that would be out again. And here, as you can see, you create another, whatever you want record here that you want to save into the second table. You can do that as well, but if you scroll down, as you can see under usage, it explains how it works, the merge statement here, and that is happening behind the scenes. So this is like, it's a merge statement. We insert the data if it doesn't exist. We update the record if the ID already exists in the table. But let's click here, read data from a database, input byting. And then if you follow the example here, now we can perform a select, right? So that would be the new item into our function.json. Let's create one ourselves. Let me switch to VS Code. Let's create a new function, HTTP trigger one, called read, just simple. Read anonymous authorization level, and this is our new function. And now let's check the function.json again for the read API now. Click on here and let me paste exactly the item beneath. Let's add another item, and this is straight from the documentation. So let's change the name and then call it read item. That we are going to use as a parameter for in our Python file. Type SQL direction in, right? This time it's in. Command text, let's say we have only ID. Have to make some changes here from our table where ID equals ID, and as you can see here we have parameters as well, and this is how we are going to add a query parameter in our API when we call the API in order to get the record we want. So let's go back into our init.py, and here just paste read item, and that would be func.sql row list this time. Remove that, and then let's use rows equals. Now remember, we are using a map here. The iterable would be the read item, and then we have a lambda, an anonymous function x, and then we want x dot to JSON, right? And from here we want JSON dot loads to convert it to JSON. Perfect. We have to import JSON here, import JSON, right? And then we have the JSON, and then convert map to list. Otherwise it's going to return a map object that we won't be able to get the data. So if actually, let's remove that, just return the, let's say, JSON.dumps, and that would be rows, and status code whatever 201, and click on save. And this would actually return into our API. It would return, well, it would return the results from the SQL query based on the we are going to select only the record that we want we provided in the API. Okay, now we have the select statement, the read API. Let's go back to the documentation again. We can scroll down and find how to delete records. As you can see, we have store procedure here. Microsoft the documentation provides this store procedure. Let's copy that, paste it into our SQL database. Let's remove a few things, and no need to make it complicated, just simple as possible. Select ID and title. Let's change UUID into ID here and run the procedure. Okay, we have now we have this procedure delete to do, right? Let's go again to our Azure documentation, and if we scroll down to the function.json here, we need to add one extra item that will point to the stored procedure. And we are going to pass the ID as a query parameter, of course, because we want to delete a specific record. Right? Let me copy that and switch to our VS Code. Let's create one more function called delete, right? Anonymous authorization level, perfect. Let's go into our function.json. Let's add this item here. Let's call this delete item, right? That points to our store procedure we just created. Direction is in again, and here just make sure that this is store procedure and not like text like before. Click copy that, delete item, and let's go into our delete the init file in our delete function and paste the delete item here. Func.sql row list, right? Again, it's the same as before, like the init py, it's exactly the same. Just copy that, go back to delete, init here, paste that here, and import JSON, right? And here use delete item as an iterable, of course. Remove that, don't know where this came from. Save, and now it's time to actually deploy the functions into our function app. And here click on next to the create function button. This it has a button where we deploy, so click on deploy to function app, select the function app you want. For us, it's I think that was it, the second one. Click on deploy, and it's going to deploy whatever we have created, and we would be ready to test the API. If everything went according to plan, we would be able to run all the APIs, create an item in the database, and update an item, search for an item, and delete an item, right? Just give it a couple of minutes. The deployment is finished, so if you go into your function app and click on refresh, you will see 3 APIs now, 3 functions that perform all those CRUD activities. Now, before we test those APIs, we need to go into configuration. So on the left panel here, scroll down and click the configuration blade. Click on that. And remember, in our function.json files, we provided an SQL connection string. So we have to provide this SQL connection string in order to be able to connect to our database. Click on New Application Setting, paste the name that we provided. Here we provide the SQL connection string, and the value, you can find the value into the database. So scroll down, go into your database, scroll down where it says connection string, and click the first one and paste it in here in the value. Click on OK, click on Save, click on Continue, and now this SQL connection string would be used in our functions in order to connect to the database. Click on Upsert. Let's actually insert an item, right? Let's insert an item. The first thing we need to do is insert an item. Click on Code and Test. Click on Test and Run. And here in the body, just add ID, say ID 1 and title. Title that would be test, right? And then click on Run. Let's wait, and this will create an item in the database. Yep, you can see success here, and in the logs you will see that it performed a merge statement here, right? You can see the merge into the database, and etc, etc. Now, if it doesn't match, insert a new record. If it matches, update a new one. So let's update this record, and actually let's go into the database and see the results. In the query editor, log in and refresh. Let's select, right? Yeah, we have one record. Let's update this record. Let's click on Run, and that would be test 2 now in our database. Success. Let's select again. You can see test 2, right? Let's add an ID with 2, and now we have 2 records. Perfect. Let's test now the select statement. Let's select only the first record with ID 1. Again, click on Code plus Test. Click Test Run and add the query parameter, that would be ID, and provide value of 1. And this should return a JSON with the data of this record, right? Let's wait. My internet connection is not the best. This is why it's taking so long. And here we have the results, ID and title 2, right? Let's test the last one, delete, the delete API. Click on Code and Test again. Let's run it. Test and run. Add a query parameter, that would be ID, and a value 1. And click on here. Come on. It should delete one record, and yes, we return only what is left, so it's only record 2 left, but let's verify that in the database. So select again, and we have only one record. Perfect, splendid. One thing to remember, when you use a stored procedure, you might get an error again because your function app doesn't have the privileges to execute a procedure. So go back to your database, and what you need to do is to grant execute to your function app here. That would be function app demo, right? And you just grant execute in order for your function app to run the procedure. One last thing I want to show you is that you can use PyODBC in order to connect to the database. You don't need to use the default functionality behind the scenes that Azure Functions provide. I will show you what I mean by now. Let's create an HTTP trigger and example py, and let's create one more function. Let me paste the code from my notes, and here we are going to use the PyODBC library in order to connect to the database. It's again very simple. You provide the server, the database, the driver, the query you want, the username and the password of the database. We create this connection string here, and then with the cursor we execute the query, we fetch the results. So let's call this row and we return success. Now this is how you can use the PyODBC in order to connect to the database if you want to perform more complex queries or other activities, right? Because sometimes you want something more complicated and more complex and you need flexibility, so just write your query straight and fire it straight away with ODBC, right? Again, you have to import the library, and if you go into the requirements.txt, you have to add, of course, the library here, right? And you can deploy that. Let's actually deploy this. The function has been deployed, as you can see here. Click on the new function that we created, code plus test. Here we have our function, our new function that uses PyODBC. If we test and run it, it should return one record. Remember, we didn't return anything in the HTTP response, but if we wait for the logs to see, because actually we have a log info with the data. Here we are. It took like a few seconds, but you can see here that in the logs, you can see the output, which is a tuple from the database. This is what it was left, the last record in the database. Remember, if we select again from the database, you will see this is the record that we see in the logs. Now, apparently, you can do a lot of things with that. Use your own SQL code, etc., etc. If those, this functionality provided by Microsoft is not enough for you. This is everything for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video about Azure Functions. In a similar fashion, you can build an API for CRUD operations with Cosmos DB. In my opinion, Azure Functions are one of the most flexible and useful Azure components. Microsoft has already provided pretty much everything, so you can start developing right away. If you like the video, please click the like button, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you.